Welcome all the attendees to this event, which will be held in English. However, let me do part of this introduction in Spanish, since one of the priorities of the Fundación Ramón Areces is to foster the use of the Spanish language in science. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Daniel Santín, soy profesor de Economía en la Universidad Complutense y en nombre del director general de la Fundación Ramón Areces, don Raimundo Pérez Hernández, les doy la más afectuosa bienvenida a este seminario. En primer lugar, quiero agradecerles a todos ustedes, autoridades académicas, profesores y alumnos de Economía y de otros campos, señoras y señores, por haberse desplazado a la sede de la Fundación para disfrutar de esta conferencia. En segundo lugar, quisiera agradecer a la Universidad Rey Juan Carlos, entidad que junto a la Fundación Ramón Areces organiza esta conferencia, por este esfuerzo conjunto que permite hacer realidad este evento. La Universidad Rey Juan Carlos ha nombrado hoy doctor honoris causa al profesor Angrist por sus contribuciones metodológicas y empíricas al análisis de las relaciones causales. Muchos de los trabajos del profesor Angrist se han centrado en el área de economía de la educación. Por ello, en tercer lugar, me gustaría anunciar que el seminario de hoy, titulado Escaping the Illusion, inaugura un grupo de trabajo en economía de la educación para la realización de seminarios y monografías. Este grupo está impulsado por distintos profesores, entre ellos Antonio Cabrales,
Antonio Cabrales,
a los cuales agradezco su iniciativa y su invitación. Los seminarios tendrán lugar aquí, en la sede de la Fundación, y el próximo seminario de este grupo será impartido por el profesor Matt Graff de la Universidad de Brown,
from Brown University in February 2023.
Finally, I would like to thank Professor Joshua Angrist, Professor of Economics at MIT and Nobel Prize in Economics in 2021, for being here today. Professor Angrist's bio is well known to all of us, so I will not go into the details. I just would like to say, on behalf of the vast majority of students and professors in economics and other related research fields, thank you, Professor Angrist, for all your research work, which for us is a source of learning, reflection, and inspiration. Finally, for introducing the conference, let me say that in the handbook Mastering Metrics, co-authored by Professor Angrist and Piske, there is a section titled The Elite Illusion, which starts with the following thought: I seek not to know the answer, but to understand the questions. Let's try to understand all the questions and answers that for sure are going to arise during the conference. And again, Professor Angrist, thank you so much for having accepted to be here today with us. And that's all. Let's enjoy the conference. Professor Angrist, the floor is yours.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Gracias por invitarme. Now I'll switch to English. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. It's wonderful to be back in Madrid after long absence and see some old friends and making so many new ones. As many of you know, I'm a labor economist and an applied econometrician. And my job is to use and to teach others to use econometric tools to untangle knotty questions of cause and effect. Causal questions are challenging because they force us to imagine what would have been at the end of a road not taken. I'm thrilled to have the chance to share a few of the insights from my econometric work. The lessons that I'll sketch for you today come not only from my research, but also from over a quarter century of teaching econometrics and labor economics at MIT. I know that many of you will remember your own college economics and statistics courses very fondly, so hopefully this will be a fun reminder of that material. Well, I'm very lucky to teach at MIT. There's a picture of our dome, famous dome. Every day is like a scene from the movie Good Will Hunting. Though I've put a secret Latin motto, so this is also a test from your school days. We'll come back to it. I put a secret Latin motto on the dome, was hard to get the administration to agree to do that. Our students, of course, are very keen to follow in the footsteps of our most famous alum, Iron Man Tony Stark, class of 1987. But of course, as you know, and we all know, the real MIT differs somewhat from the Hollywood version. One thing for sure, though, my students, no matter where they come from, are thrilled to have arrived at the Institute, as we call it, bright young people who have studied thousands of hours in an effort to earn a coveted place in our entering class. And if you've seen the latest Spider-Man movie, you'll know the extraordinary lengths people go to get into MIT. Spells cast, portals to parallel universes opened, villains unleashed. MIT applicant Peter Parker even saves our Dean of Admissions, there she is, on the Alexander Hamilton Bridge in a scene from No Way Home. Now that, of course, is exaggerated. Few of our students have actually done that. It is true, though, that our incoming students are justifiably proud of themselves. Their MIT acceptance is a moment of personal triumph. And MIT, of course, is proud to graduate students who accomplish great things. Still, this early success notwithstanding, I've long pondered a delicate question that I'll discreetly share with you today. Are my many successful MIT students successful because they went to MIT? On the first day of my class, Econometric Data Science, my new students would likely say yes, and MIT education is surely the key to a lifetime of economic success. After all, why else would they have worked so hard to get here? Yet on the last day of my class, and you can take the online version, there's a link here in my notes, let's see if that works, Mastering Econometrics, many of their answers will have changed. Their answers change because my students learn that seemingly obvious conclusions are often mistaken. The belief that highly selective schools like MIT are the key to economic success is an illusion of sorts. In fact, my colleagues and I have a name for this pervasive misreading of the data. We call this the elite illusion. I'll come back to that. I've spent my career untangling messy cause and effect questions, many related to education and earnings. My research covers questions like, would you have earned more if you'd waited a little longer to start your family? Would you have learned more if you'd gone to an elementary school with smaller classes? And as I've already floated, would you have enjoyed greater career success if you'd enrolled at a more selective university? That's especially important in the MIT context. These questions are hard to answer because they force us to imagine what would have been in an alternate reality defined by different choices than the ones we made. This idea of alternate realities is captured memorably in Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. Many Americans learn this in school. It goes like this: 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. For Frost, it's a question of whether taking one road and not another makes all the difference. This idea is actually known to my tribe through a special kind of concept known as a potential outcome. We often label potential outcomes Y1 and Y0, and I've drawn those here as cacti on the different roads that my student, imagined as a grasshopper, might take. The idea is central. The idea of potential outcomes is central to modern econometrics. For my students, when I ask about this, it's a question of whether going to MIT, that's their Y1, really changes their lives, or whether they're simply smart, motivated, driven kids likely to succeed whether they enrolled at an elite institution like MIT or attend a less selective but more affordable public university instead. We all wonder about questions like that, questions of what might have been had we taken a different path. But the road not taken isn't necessarily obscure. Although we can't usually say what lies at the end of the road not taken for a particular individual, we can often map what would have happened to groups of people. And we don't need magic powers like the Marvel Universe for that either. Rather, the road not taken is revealed through something just as cool, econometrics. Well, it's just as cool to me. and apparently it's Nobel Prize worthy. Here's the poster for the 2021 prize that I'm proud to share with Dave Card and Guido Imbens. It's a one-page description of what the award recognizes. And just to summarize, the prize explains how econometrics is the social science that converts abstract economic models into information that people can actually use. The econometric toolkit has the power to answer causal questions involving potential counterfactual outcomes. In other words, the outcomes that lie at the end of the road not taken. Econometric answers to causal questions change how my students think, and I hope they'll change the way you think too. Imagine the road not taken by my MIT students. Specifically, let's ask whether my students would have been less successful career-wise had they attended a lesser school than MIT, say Harvard or Stanford. In an ideal world, at least as far as research goes, we'd answer that question by running a randomized trial, an experiment. Now, behind the scenes, as most of you will know, medical researchers have been running such experiments for decades. Randomized clinical trials, sometimes called randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are used to establish the safety and efficacy of new drugs and therapies. And as you've likely noticed, over the last couple years, RCTs have become visible like never before. In the spring of 2020, biotech startup Moderna quickly synthesized a candidate COVID vaccine using new mRNA technology. Before distributing the new vaccine, Moderna researchers had to establish the new drug's efficacy and safety. This they did in an RCT. First, they found some volunteers, 30,000 in fact, including me. That's my name on an investigational drug label as a participant in the mRNA clinical trial at the Boston Medical Center site. Having found subjects, they tossed a virtual coin. Although it says here that I got mRNA vaccine, in fact, I might have gotten placebo. Half, chosen at random, got a fake vaccine. At the time I did this, a colleague of mine who's married to a physician was shocked to learn that I had signed up for the trial. Dangerous stuff, he said. At the time, Moderna had been working with mRNA technology for over a decade, with nothing of therapeutic value to show for it. Now, as we all know, the trial turned out rather well. Hardly anyone in the vaccinated group got sick. I didn't get sick either, even though, as it turns out, I got the placebo. Random assignment of treatment ensures that the experimental and control groups are truly comparable. The only possible explanation for sharply lower COVID infection rates, among the treated is therefore the fact that the treated got vaccinated. This single rigorous study helped change the course of the pandemic to the betterment of all our lives. In the same spirit, back to the question of MIT, I've long hoped to convince MIT's admissions staff to randomly admit students in a social experiment of the mRNA sort. Instead of making our applicants fill out dozens of forms and write, or at least submit, terrible essays, why not just toss a coin? Alas, I have yet to hit academic pay dirt with this idea. For some reason, our admissions office resists my proposal to reject half of the applicants at random and then survey everybody to see how their lives turned out. Economists like me must often face the fact that this sort of ideal experiment is out of reach. It will be deemed too disruptive to real people's lives. Sometimes the intervention we want to study is not practically studyable in an RCT. So we must be creative instead. When economists like me can't conduct an RCT, we go out and find one. That may sound fanciful. Randomized trials are highly engineered social experiments. Where might such a thing be found randomly? Well, as it turns out, natural experiments happen all around us. You just have to know where to look. I found my first natural experiment as a Princeton PhD student, inspired by my thesis advisor, Orly Ashenfelter, and motivated by my own personal experience. Shortly after graduating from Oberlin College in Ohio, I moved to Israel. Soon after that, I was drafted into the Israeli army, where I served 2 years in an IDF paratrooper unit. I thought at the time that army service would be a fun adventure. Well, fun, as it turned out, isn't the right word. But dusty army life, and there's a picture of me in uniform, definitely ramped up my enthusiasm for graduate school. Once I was discharged from the army, I was keen to hang up my boots and hunker down with a computer. This led me to graduate study at Princeton towards an economics PhD. Although I struggled in the transition from army life to grad school, I can now say all's well that ends well for me. But for many, military service might be a costly diversion from education and employment experience that's more valuable. So which is it? Harmless, maybe even valuable, adventure, or damaging diversion? In asking this, we're asking how military service changes veterans' lives. In particular, I'm interested as a labor economist in their earnings later in life. In other words, we'd like to compare what lies at the end of the road taken for soldiers with their destinations on a counterfactual path where they don't actually serve. For economists like me who study the labor market, that's a very important question because the Pentagon is one of the largest employers in the world. The long-run effects of military service matter not only to me, but also to millions of veterans and to the many high school students considering military service instead of college. If only we could randomize military service in an RCT. Remarkably, the US military came very close to this in the early 1970s, a period of transition from conscription, a military draft, to today's all-volunteer force. From 1970 to 73, the order in which men were called up was determined by a draft lottery number, and there's a picture of the first lottery, with the director of what was called the selective service system picking numbers at random out of a barrel. Later, they used computers to do that. They realized that that's not the greatest way to randomize, but it worked. They assigned a number from 1 to 365 to every birthday in the cohorts of men born 1950 to 53, and then they called them in order. Men with low draft lottery numbers were called to their local armed forces induction station for possible service. Those with high draft lottery numbers needn't have served if they didn't want to. The natural experiment this scenario suggests is to compare the earnings later in life of men with low draft lottery numbers to earnings for men with high draft lottery numbers. But it isn't as simple as that. Many called for induction, the draft, avoided service. They managed to avoid service by having an exemption of some kind, or a deferment as it was called. Some were disqualified for health reasons. Some were disqualified while in college. That's what you see in the movie Woodstock. Meanwhile, roughly 20% of men with high draft lottery numbers nevertheless volunteered for service. In fact, during the Vietnam era, as throughout American history, most soldiers were volunteers. So, the draft lottery, while certainly random, is not a real RCT. It's messy in all sorts of ways, and we need an econometric framework to account for that. I made progress on this messy experiments problem as a Princeton PhD student, analyzing the draft lottery in a traditional econometric framework. That was my thesis, my PhD thesis. But aspects of my work remained unsatisfying. Just who are the draft lottery estimates relevant for? The answer came in the basement laundry of a subsidized Harvard apartment where I lived while serving as a junior faculty member in the Harvard Economics Department, my first academic job. A rookie professor named Guido Imbens joined me in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1 year after I arrived. Guido and I did our laundry together in the basement of my building. He knew more than how to fold shirts. He was and is a talented theoretical econometrician. Watching our clothes spin, we got to ponder the meaning of my draft lottery estimates. The crux of the matter is that a natural experiment like the draft lottery doesn't reveal causal effects for everyone. The lottery doesn't teach us about effects on those with deferments who avoided the draft. Likewise, the lottery reveals nothing about effects on true volunteers, that is, men keen to serve with or without being drafted. The draft lottery reveals causal effects on veterans who were conscripted as a result of having a low lottery number and wouldn't have served otherwise. Guido and I came up with a mathematical model that formalizes this point.
and can be used to describe the affected group, which we called the group of compliers. The term compliers comes indeed from the world of RCTs. That's our North Star in pursuit of causal effects. In many clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, some of the subjects randomly assigned to treatment don't end up getting treated. An experimental subject who's treated as planned is said to comply with the experiment's treatment protocol. The average difference in potential outcomes for compliers is called a local average treatment effect, or LATE for short. Guido and I debuted LATE in a short theoretical paper published in the journal Econometrica in 1994. The LATE paper, as it's now known, takes the form of a few mathematical theorems. Here's one. Z is an instrumental variable, something like the draft lottery number. D is a treatment of interest, veteran status in this case. These are the first stage in reduced forms. Compare the average veteran status rate between people with the instrument switched on and switched off, difference those. Compare the average of outcomes with the instrument switched off and switched on, difference those, and divide. And what do you get when you divide? The LATE theorem says you get something that is interpretable and useful. What you get is the average causal effect of military service on men who have D1 equals 1 and D0 equals 0, and what that means is they serve when the instrument is switched on and not otherwise. So that's my summary, and that's all the math I think I have in today's handout, but I will test you on that later. Okay, so LATE applies very concretely to this problem, and as it turns out, it applies to the sort of empirical problem that's become my bread and butter. In this case, LATE also resolves an interesting paradox in estimates of the effects of military service. Some studies, including one by me, show that volunteering for military service actually increases earnings. The LATE theorem explains why being forced into the military as a conscript has a very different effect, reducing veterans' earnings by as much as 15% long after their service. More generally, my work with Guido extended the econometric theory behind the instrumental variables, or IV method, of estimating causal effects. An instrumental variable is a naturally occurring and often indirect source of variation that creates a natural experiment. In the case of the draft lottery study, the instrument is draft eligibility. IV allows us to capture causal effects of interventions like conscription that can't be cleanly randomized in an RCT. And my work with Guido allows us to look at IV estimates in a new and more realistic way, explaining why different sorts of experiments manipulating a given treatment have different causal effects. The LATE theorem turned out to have wide application. Here's another one. The effects of childbearing on women's wages, an important issue in today's labor market. Does the burden of childbearing reduce women's wages below what their wages would have been, so that's the counterfactual, had they not given birth? And if so, for what sorts of women and for how long after birth? We can imagine an RCT that answers such questions, but the baby delivery RCT is likely to be a randomized trial that will continue to have to imagine. It's likely to remain fanciful. We can instead seek instruments, mechanisms that randomly assign babies to some families but not to others. For starters, let's compare families with 2 children to families with 3 children. Why do that? Well, 3 used to be the norm among American married couples. Now it's 2. Of course, there's no randomness there. Naturally, some parents decide to have a 3rd child, but those decisions are far from random. They relate to the individual circumstances of those families. Yet, a few wanting 2 children indeed get a 3rd randomly, surprised, though not necessarily delighted, when their second birth is to twins. Twin second births randomly drive sibship size, that's the number of children in the family, from 2 to 3. Buy 1, get 1, 3. So, where do babies come from? The stork drops our first instrument for family size, the event of a multiple second birth, which produces a 3rd child randomly. Here's another instrument for family size. You've probably heard that in some countries, parents prefer sons to daughters. Not so in the US. American parents are interested in having a diversified sibling sex portfolio. In US data and elsewhere, mothers of 2 girls or 2 boys are more likely to have a 3rd child than are the mothers of a mixed-sex sibship. Like my mother, after having me, the oldest, and my second-born brother, Misha, our mom really wanted a daughter. And that led to the birth of our youngest sibling in the middle, Ezra, a boy, at which point our mother retired for childbearing, giving up on the daughter dream. Since child sex is randomly assigned, the event of having a same-sex sibship, as also described here in the graphic, me and Misha, you should be able to figure out which one is which. The event of having a same-sex sibship is a natural experiment instrument that changes family size. Here are the twins and same-sex estimates. Very briefly, divide the reduced form by the first stage, and you'll find out that a 3rd child born by virtue of multiple births reduces women's weeks worked by about 3, whereas if you do the same thing for same-sex, divide the reduced form by the first stage, you'll find out that having a 3rd child reduces women's weeks worked by about 6 weeks. So that's an interesting finding. Now, something else that's very interesting about these findings is, while conventional wisdom says that having more children reduces women's earnings, IV estimates indeed show that, but they also show something with more nuance. Having another child reduces earnings, but the effect of a quasi-experimentally delivered birth is smaller and shorter-lived than you might think. And twins' instruments are special. The twins' experience might feel very intense to the parents of twins, but as it turns out, the late theorem will explain why twins-based IV estimates are likely to be smaller than all other sources of family size variation. The late theorem resolves that paradox. Okay, enough econometrics. What of the elite illusion? Much of my work shows that firmly held beliefs about human affairs can be challenged or even disproven by a good natural experiment. And this is especially true in the domain of education and schools. Economists like me believe that decisions related to schooling matter greatly for most people. We're not surprised by the intense public controversy over who gets to attend the best schools. In the US, this debate burns hottest today in the context of selective public schools, that is, high schools where students must ace a challenging admissions test to get in. Bostonians, for example, focus on exam schools like the Boston Latin School, which is pictured here in the slide, and is America's oldest high school, that is. New Yorkers hope for a seat at one of the city's legendary specialized high schools, Bronx Science, Brooklyn Tech, or Stuyvesant. Exam schools, as they're called, exam schools like these are seen as the pinnacle of a city's school system. Now, while anybody could take a test to get into one of these schools, Black and Hispanic students are much less likely to gain a coveted exam school seat than are Asians and whites. For instance, even though 1/3 of New York City students are Black, last year only 8 Black students were offered seats at stratospherically selective Stuyvesant High. Given these disparities, exam school admissions are invariably contentious. This slide gives some of the media attention to this issue. Yet, arguments over who gets an exam school seat ignore a fundamental question. Are exam school seats worth fighting for? My research answers this question with a surprising but resounding no. The exam school admissions test gives us an opportunity to design a natural experiment. We do this by zooming in on the group of students with test scores near the cutoff for admission. Some are offered a seat, some aren't. But on the whole, the students just making and just missing the cutoff look similar. The results of this comparison, known as a regression discontinuity design, are striking. Elite high schools are terrific at selecting smart students. That fact is documented here by plotting peer achievement against the admissions test, and what you see is a big jump at the cutoff. If you clear the cutoff, you have much higher achieving peers. But exam schools boost neither learning nor college enrollment nor any other outcome that we've examined for those who attend them. That's the elite illusion. While families scramble for seats at prestigious schools, the students who attend these schools are no better off as a result. And you can see that here, where we've plotted a test score, again, against the admissions test. This is a later test score, so it's an outcome, and there's no jump in the individual applicant's achievement. The peers are much better, but my own learning is unchanged. Many of you will recognize this as a visual depiction of a regression discontinuity design. So, where does that leave our old friend, Robert Frost, the poet at the crossroads? Maybe my students would do well to set Frost aside and heed instead the advice of legendary Major League Baseball slugger Yogi Berra. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. The other path might not be as you imagined it. The fork might not matter much at all. For my MIT students, this lesson begins in my class, Econometric Data Science. Starting with the most elementary econometric tools, I show them that yes, those who attend elite private colleges like MIT earn more later in life than those who took a humbler and less expensive post-secondary road. But using more sophisticated instruments, the kind that Guido and I have spent our careers refining, a different picture emerges. Well-controlled comparisons show that those who chose cheaper and less selective public universities earn as much as those who opted for the elites. In college, too, the elite advantage is illusory. Now, the good news for bright students everywhere is that hard work and ambition trump the name of the school on your diploma. Your fate is not determined by a college admissions officer. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe I benefited greatly from my elite college education, both undergraduate and graduate. And by the way, my draft lottery research notwithstanding, I don't think my earnings were reduced by my military service. And even though I was assigned placebo in the mRNA vaccine trial, the fact that I didn't get COVID has not left me a vaccine skeptic. So while I hope you've enjoyed hearing my story, my life and times do not constrain my scientific research. Students of econometrics learn not to be swayed by compelling individual stories, for these stories might not be representative. They might even be misleading. I ask my students to rely instead on the econometric tools that are our stock in trade. In domains like education, where we have few opportunities to run real RCTs, natural experiments analyzed using instrumental variables and regression discontinuity designs allow us to test our assumptions and escape our illusions. By the end of our semester together, I hope my econometric students will have learned to question conventional wisdom, both in their own lives and as educated citizens. And I hope you will be questioners too. Your path, like mine, will be illuminated by the questions you ask and by your openness to surprising answers. As Robert Frost might have said, that's what will make all the difference. Thank you. And Daniel tells me that we have time for questions. Daniel, you want to moderate that?
Thank you so much for the conference, for the seminar. So we have time for some questions. I only have 2 requests. So please ask short questions and please direct to the point questions. So which want to be the one in asking? So Professor Cabrales over there. I don't know if someone can reach a microphone to ask him. Well, I can do this. There is no problem. So if you can go to there in.
Thanks for the nice presentation. I was wondering to which extent we can say the people that are treated in the natural experiments you have talked about are either the ones that are going to be the less smart person in the Harvard class or the smartest person in the Michigan class, let's say. Can you extrapolate from this to the median person in Harvard or Michigan?
That's a great question. So you're asking specifically about the elite illusion and the regression discontinuity design that's implicit in this figure. So perhaps what we're doing is we're comparing somebody who kind of barely gets into Harvard, but isn't really equipped to succeed there with somebody who's the best student at, say, the University of Michigan. So there are various ways that we've addressed that in our work. Of course, I can't describe them all this evening, but we look at schools with different cutoffs, and then we have some good natural experiments where it's possible to kind of control for the tie-breaking variable, turn that into something that's unrelated to student ability, and still have a good experiment at the cutoff. And that reveals the same basic pattern. The other thing that we've been able to do, and this is based on our work in New York City, New York City has a wonderfully elaborate match between students and schools. And the New York City match between students and schools involves an element of regression discontinuity tie-breaking with an element of actual random assignment. So there are people who are randomly assigned to selective enrollment schools, and that treatment effect as well comes out zero. And that kind of very much hits the nail on the head. It's an excellent question, and we've always been concerned about that.
Okay, any other question? So, no? Over there, yes?
Hello. I would like to ask you if these results can be extrapolated to some top universities inside a given country, not just in top global universities.
Sorry, where's the question? Yeah. What was the question?
I mean, if you can extrapolate the results to top universities inside a country. Maybe in India, the top university is New Delhi University. Mm-hmm. These results can be extrapolated there?
Well, I don't know anything about India. I have colleagues who know a lot about India. The setting for the results on sort of MIT-type experiments, that's indeed US schools and US data. The original study showing that there doesn't seem to be any benefit to going to a more selective college is by Alan Kruger and Stacy Dale. Alan was my friend and collaborator who unfortunately died a few years ago. Now that work for the US has been replicated. So Alan and Stacy went back to it with more data and better data in a paper that was published in 2014. And very recently, Jack Mountjoy, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, has looked at schools in the University of Texas public university system. So there, the idea of elite and non-elite is all much lower down. So it's not, MIT and Harvard at the top. It's the University of Texas, say, at Austin versus less selective UT Dallas. And again, Jack finds very little return to college selectivity. I can't say how it would come out in India, of course. It could be that there are settings where college selectivity is highly correlated with college quality. But it's not something we see in the US. And I think there's a broader point, that work is meant to show, which is the title of my talk, Beware the Elite Illusion. Just because a particular setting or institution has good outcomes doesn't mean that it's a high quality or high value added institution. It may be fine, but certainly you should consider the possibility that a lot of what you're seeing is selection bias, is differences in people on the way in and not the causal effect on the way out.
Thank you for your speech. Quick question. Who brings in the prestige, the students to the institution or the institution to the students?
Well, that's I don't know quite how to answer that. Why is an institution prestigious? Some of it is historical. Harvard predates the American Revolution. So it's had a lot of time to build up social capital. It isn't the case that it was always highly selective, but in recent memory, it's been very selective. And so people kind of associate schools that are selective with good outcomes.
Can I make in Spanish the question? Can I make in Spanish?
Daniel will translate for me. Well, that's okay. It's probably not worth setting up, Daniel. Is it? Okay. Yes, I hear you.
Ok, muchas gracias por la presentación. Mi pregunta, I am aerospace engineer, and in Spain we have big difference between tenemos muchas diferencias entre la capacidad de los ingenieros y las titulaciones y la realidad industrial. Es decir, muchas veces preparamos a la gente para algo que realmente no necesitamos en el país. Creo que la universidad debe tener gran relación entre necesidades industriales y formación. En la universidad suya, en MIT, ¿tienen relación con la industria para titular o formar a las personas que estudian en su universidad?
Well, MIT engages with industry in all sorts of ways, and there's an effort to be in contact with potential employers. Maybe we could do one more if it's related to my research. You had a question, right? Why don't you go ahead? One more if it's related to my research. Or there's somebody in the back there.
Professor, I'm a master student, and I'm using 2SLS and DVD, do some research, empirical research. And I'm using IV, and in your mind, how to define a good IV or bad IV? I think sometimes I can use test to test it and measure it, but for some people who don't have economics training, they don't think IV is reliable.
So, do I understand your question correctly? You're saying, how do we find good instruments? Is that the question? Good instrumental variables? That's a great question. Of course, students in particular would like to know. There is no magic formula, but there is sort of an algorithm. So, suppose you're interested in military service. The draft lottery, well, I got lucky there. So I learned about the draft lottery from my thesis advisor, Orly Ashenfelter. I was taking labor economics, graduate labor economics, in the fall of 1986, and Orly Ashenfelter came into class one day, and he said, I saw this thing in the New England Journal of Medicine. Actually, he saw it on TV. A news story about an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and he said there was some guys that did something very interesting. They compared the death rates of men with low and high draft lottery numbers. Somebody should do that for their earnings. And I said, that's a great idea. I'll go do that. And I went from class to the library and I found the paper. So the moral of the story is the moral of that story, and then I'll tell a second story, you don't have to have good ideas. You just have to recognize them when you hear them, and then pursue them. And you're often likely to hear them from your faculty, but not only. You may get good ideas just by watching the news. So it pays to be engaged with what's going on in politics and civil society and paying attention to the issues of the day. A second story related to that is after I had started working on the draft lottery paper, I had written that as a graduate student. Alan Kruger came to Princeton, where he was an assistant professor. And we spent a lot of time together talking about research. And Alan and I started talking about, well, I had used the draft lottery to estimate the effects of serving in the Vietnam era armed forces. So these are men who served in the 1970s. But, you know, America in the 1970s is very different from America in the 1950s, and the Vietnam War is very different from World War II. Wouldn't it be neat if we had an instrument for veteran status, something that predicts quasi-experimentally the veteran status, the military service of the World War II cohorts? And so we agreed that would be a great project, that would be a good paper. And we set out to find an instrument for that, and the way that we found the instrument for that, which turned out to be quarter of birth, is we went through the government documents of the period. And we looked at the reports that were published by the government agency, it was called the Selective Service Administration, describing how they induct soldiers. And what we discovered there is there wasn't actually a lottery, but there was a birthday-based sequence. And they just went through the year in calendar order of date of birth, so January 1st, and so on. And so there was a season of birth or a quarter birth pattern in veteran status, and that was prompted by a study of the institutions. So the general lesson from that is you can often find an instrument by digging deep into the details of how a process works. You may have to spend a lot of time in the library. Nowadays you can do that, of course, online, so it's gotten a little easier, but you have to really dig in and master the details.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor, for this talk. And let's give a final applause to Professor Angrist.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for your questions.